We all have crazy relatives that are famous in the family, whether it's for being eccentric, for giving back to the community, or any other reason. I'm going to be talking about my great 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 aunt, Mary Ellen Dye, who inspires me due to her contributions to society. Mary owned a boarding house for women and children, she invested in real estate, and she also had a very peculiar personality. I've always admired my great 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 aunt Mary due to her boarding house that she owned for women and children. When she was a young woman, Mary worked as a teacher in Washington, but she had a dream of running her own private kindergarten. Each year, she would put in her notice of resignation at the end of the school year, but would return the following school year. However, one year she resigned for good, she packed up her bags and moved to California, where she started her lifelong dream of owning a boarding house and nursery. Boarding houses that catered to women and children were common during this post-World War II era, as many of the women's husbands had run off due to the trauma that they had gotten during the war, according to Sean Purdue's analysis of the housing situation in Canada after World War II. Through the years, Mary moved to different places, but wherever she lived, she always ran some sort of boarding house or hotel, typically for single working women and their children. The most notable house that she ran was the Gale Manor, located in California, which she mainly rented out to single women and their children during the Great Depression era. Gale Manor struck the lives of many working mothers and their children, so much so that one of the children that grew up living in Gale Manor wrote a book about Mary's life, simply titled Gale Manor. This book tells about how Mary came to own Gale Manor, in addition to telling about the lives of the people that lived at Gale Manor and how that their situations were changed for the better once they got to Gale Manor. One story tells about a little girl who had been living in a different boarding house for women and children, and how the conditions of that place were damaging, both mentally and physically, to both the women and especially to the children that lived there. This little girl had developed pneumonia while living at this boarding house, and during one meal she threw up her food. The people that were watching her while her mother was at work forced this little girl to eat her vomit. This incident broke this little girl, and she lost her will to live. Her mother was advised by a doctor to find a different living situation or her daughter would die. Luckily, Mary had compassion upon hearing this story and let the mother and daughter into Gale Manor. Gale Manor and Mary's other boarding houses were a saving grace to many of the women and children that lived there. My great-aunt Mary became wealthy by investing in real estate and also by running her boarding house for women and children. While she was not making much, if any, money while she first established this boarding house, she was eventually able to make a decent profit off of it by running the boarding house. However, the boarding house and nursery were not the only contributing factor to her wealth. Mary accidentally made a decent sum of money by buying real estate and then selling it for a higher price once the value rose. Typically, the properties that she sold were buildings that she had used as a boarding house in the past before moving to a different location, or buildings that she had bought that were located around the building house that she was currently in. The book Gale Manor explains that she would buy these properties around the boarding house for many different reasons, whether it was because the tenants of that building complained too much about the children and she wanted to have the ability to kick them out of the building, or because she wanted to use the land around the building to extend the playground for the children. My great-aunt had a good heart and gave back to the people through her boarding house, but she also had an interesting character and a peculiar personality that led to many stories that her family could tell for years. My grandfather tells about how his Aunt Mary had always been a little bit odd, but how this oddness became more present in her later years. One story he told me was that she had about 5 or 6 dogs throughout her life, and she named each of these dogs Twiggy. Her oddness was also visible to my grandfather when he received a microscope from her for his birthday, and after he remarked that he had one just like it, she offered to take it back for him. He agreed, and she took the microscope back, and he never got another present in exchange for it. Her blunt way of living and interesting life values led many people to view her as an interesting person. Even at her boarding houses, she was viewed as a harsh woman because she never played favorites with the children, and she never offered a comforting hug to any of the children. She was by no means rude, she just had a more blunt personality than people were used to. Mary was seen as crazy until she became wealthy, then she became eccentric. To conclude, my great-great-great-aunt Mary Ellen Dye fulfilled her lifelong dream of owning a boarding house for women and children. She became wealthy in her life, and she also was a very odd person. Mary gave back to the community throughout her life, and to this day, her life story continues to inspire and amuse me.